2,000 years before the Renaissance, medical theory in Western Europe was based on the humoral theory. So I just want to explain that to you. This theory asserted that keeping the body's fluids, black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm in balance would keep the body healthy. Most of what came after the Renaissance was a push to basically take medicine away from that. So additionally, medical practitioners used a variety of other medical practices, things that we would consider normal medicine that doctors do, like surgery, and others that we might think of as alternative medicine, such as nature-based medicine, and some things that we don't consider medicine at all, like astronomy and astrology. So they use these things to determine when people would get sick and how to respond when they did. I do want to add a caveat here and say that nature-based medicine did not necessarily mean herbal remedies. Although there were many herbal remedies to choose from, leeches and maggots made regular appearances, as did snake venom and antidotes for poison and pigeon poop for abscessed livers. So it was a little different. So here we see the hierarchy of medicine during the early modern period. The majority of medicine practiced during this era was done so in the home. Remedies tended to be passed down through the generations. They were often written in cookbooks or Bibles or taught to the family as necessary. Home remedies were generally easy to obtain for a reasonable price. The types of remedies could include anything from drinking different sorts of teas, improving diet, spending more time outside, or getting an increase of exercise. From setting bones to pulling teeth and sewing stitches or removing bugs from hairs, ears, and skin, the goal was to fix the ailment or injury so that the person could continue to work and adequately live their lives. Military medicine is an all-encompassing term to explain medicine and surgery that was done by the military. This was basically emergency medicine that was taught via hands-on training. The intent was to keep the person alive, and if they could rejoin the front lines, that was a bonus. Very few medical professionals were university trained during the beginning of the early modern period. During the 16th and 17th centuries, the majority of people who attended university for medicine learned theory. They learned about the theories of the ancient scholars, which were set down, about a millennium before. Through resolute commitment and passion that transcended their own reputations, doctors who studied medicine and anatomists who studied anatomy and physiology changed this expectation. By the 17th century, medical students began to learn both theory and hands-on application of that theory. Although what we would consider modern medicine was still in its infancy, most medical practitioners during this period based their work on medical theories of the time. However, there was a small subsection of people whose remedies were developed for the purpose of making money, and only making money. These inventors never actually expected their remedies to work, yet they charged exorbitant prices for these miracle cures. This type of false medicine has been termed quack medicine. There's also one other pseudo-category of medicine. It was a transitional phase between the academically trained physician and home remedies. During the 17th century, a man named Nicholas Culpeper dropped out of Cambridge University before moving to London in the hopes of finding a new direction in his life. He became an apprentice to an apothecary, Simon White, whose shop was located at the Temple Bar. Now, the Temple Bar is located right near the Thames River, right near St. Paul's and St. Bart's. It sat quite literally between the tight-packed houses of Fleet Street and the growing metropolis of Newgate. After spending over a decade as an apprentice, Culpeper quit his apprenticeship and opened his own shop. He focused his efforts on the poor and vulnerable populations. He prescribed medicines that were simple to create and easy on the body. He offered compassion to people who were grieving or heartsick. And he educated his clients about healthy eating and encouraged them to practice good hygiene. Overall, he believed that the body, the mind, and the soul needed to be tended to in order to keep a person in good health. Similarly, the Scottish physician William Buchan was also concerned with bringing simple, reliable, and effective medicine to the common person. His book, Domestic Remedies, was arranged by recognizable names of different ailments, such as of coughs or of fevers. It was initially published in Scotland in 1769. By the final printing, which took place in Philadelphia in 1871, over 145 editions had been published and reissued. Despite these advancements, there were still things that were not known during the Renaissance. People did not know what caused the plague, which frequently ravaged the continent. Anything from ominous birds to the movement of the planets, bad weather, God's disapproval, all of it was blamed for its regular outbreaks. This was because people did not generally understand disease transmission. They had a limiting understanding of what germs were, but the first germ would not be seen in their lifetimes. In a way, the concept of germs relied on imaginary thought. All they knew was that people got sick and how they observed disease spreading through their communities. To the best of their knowledge, they figured that disease traveled between people, from a person to a thing to another person, or through the air. Airborne transmission was believed to be caused by people giving other people mean looks. Medicine during the 16th and 17th centuries was in a state of extreme flux. Those who went to university to learn about medicine only learned about theory and probably never actually saw a patient. Most theories relating to anatomy and physiology were based off dissections of animals such as cows and pigs, and therefore the very basis of their information was incorrect. During the early 16th century, a Swiss physician who dubbed himself Paracelsus was unimpressed with the training that he had received as a physician, and he traveled the world trying to obtain hands-on experience. After 8 years, he returned to the university system. He took up a lecturer position at the University of Basel and in 1524, but it only took 3 years for him to become fed up with academic antics. On June 24th, 1527, he made a public spectacle and set ablaze the books of Avicenna and Galen, who were revered medieval and ancient scholars. The following year, he was removed from his position at the university. Paracelsus believed that true knowledge came from experience. His own knowledge and experience brought many things into the study of medicine, not the least of which was the idea of combining medicine with chemistry to prepare new chemical reactions utilizing iron, copper, sulfur, and mercury. In addition to healing the body, he encouraged people to consider healing the mind, and he pushed forward the study of psychology. During the same century, an Italian anatomist named Andreas Vesalius challenged much of the landscape in terms of the study of the human body. Like Paracelsus, Vesalius challenged the ancient and medieval medical theories. However, he learned from the extreme actions of his contemporary, and he decided on a more subtle yet no less dramatic approach. Rather than conducting his anatomical studies on animals and assuming that the human body responds similarly, he dissected actual human cadavers. Many people were taken aback by this brazen action. At this point, it simply wasn't done. His studies disproved many of the theories upon which medicine had been based and resulted in sketches like the one seen on the left of this slide. In 1543, he published the most accurate and detailed drawings of human anatomy in Western Europe to date. It ushered in a new era of anatomical study and included detailed information on bones, cartilage, muscles, ligaments, veins, arteries, and organs. Even though Vesalius had taken great strides to advance the study of anatomy and physiology, his theories were still met with skepticism. People didn't want to give up the old theories. Additionally, his career was cut short when what's now considered to be a medical fable, but at that point, the story was that one of his medical cadavers came back to life on the dissection table. So The family of that particular person was quite upset. They called in the Spanish Inquisition, but luckily Vesalius had some friends in high places, and King Philip II got the charges dropped as long as Vesalius left Italy. Vesalius never returned. Later during that century, the French military surgeon Ambroise Paré was able to improve upon the treatment for bullet wounds. Generally, these sorts of injuries were cauterized by wrapping a piece of linen around the end of a long metal stick, dipping it in boiling oil, and running it through the injury. Instead, Paré was able to obtain a new recipe comprised of animal fat, earthworms, rose oil, and pine resin, which was then put over the wound. The pine resin was the trick. So he noticed that those who were treated with the salve did not come down with fevers, and their wounds didn't become infected, and they recovered faster. Although he didn't understand it at the time, the pine resin disinfected the wound, but he did know that its use was more efficient and more humane than using boiling oil. Paré's military experience also gave him up-close and personal knowledge of amputations. His experiences taught him about the need for prosthetics. Over his lifetime, he drew plans for an arm that could attach at the shoulder and hold a sword, a hand that could attach at the wrist and have movable fingers, and a leg which would attach at the hip and be strong enough to support weight. Despite his sound ideas, the medical technology was not yet advanced enough for him to see his ideas come to fruition. Theories regarding how the heart worked were also studied during this time. Until the English physician William Harvey determined that the heart pumped blood and caused it to circulate around the body. It was around this time that the French philosopher René Descartes theorized that the soul was in the center of the brain and that the two worked together to cause consciousness, awareness, automatic functions, and, like blinking, and cause the body to generally run. When so much about how the body worked and how medicines affected the body were still being discovered and debated, it was easy for false practitioners of medicine to sell their wares to unsuspecting people. Many people were dependent on domestic remedies, and some never had even seen a real doctor. This made it very easy for bad actors to play upon others. Generally, quack medicine worked best on people who were afraid. Therefore, it should come as no surprise that quack medicine of this era often included remedies to cure cancer. One popular quack cure for cancer was a tobacco smoke enema. They claimed that it would clear out the body and remove the cancer. Other quack cures, like the horn of a white unicorn, were sold as an antidote for poison. Generally, these remedies were actually ground up shoe horns or goat horns. Because people did not tend to travel outside their general location, some were wary about this particular remedy. They'd never seen a unicorn, so how could they know that this was really a unicorn horn? Tests were devised to see if the horn was real or not. The most popular test was to make a circle with the powdered horn and place a spider inside of it. If the spider did not cross the ring, it was believed that the power of the unicorn horn kept it inside. There's a common misconception that all quack doctors were beggars trying to sell fake cures to get rich. In some cases, those who sold phony medicine had connections to people in key positions. For example, Arthur Dee, the son of Queen Elizabeth's mystical advisor, John Dee, was charged with selling false medicine in London. Also, John Lamb, who had once been the protege of the Duke of Buckingham, was charged with impersonating a doctor and selling false medicine. Lamb's cures were reported as being sold for as much as 40 to 50 pounds each. This has the modern equivalent purchasing power of $14,000 to $17,000. The concept of patent medicines were developed in England during the 17th century. This was an important development in pharmacology because once a medical recipe was patented, then others couldn't duplicate it. But you had to give them the recipe. The first recorded patent medicine was Anderson's Scott pills. It was patented in 1687. Anderson was a Scottish man who claimed to be the physician of King Charles I. He was lying. King Charles I physician was actually a different Scottish physician by the name of Alexander Reed. Even after these pills were patented, different recipes were sold by different people under the same name. Each person claimed that they had the only real Anderson Scott pills. One of them was even sold under the rather scary heading of, "Remember, you must die." The year after, this patent was actually voided because it had not been approved by Parliament. Pills under this name continued to be sold well into the 19th century, although it's probably safe to say the recipes changed over time. Originally, Anderson Scott pills was a purgative used to strengthen the stomach, relieve seasickness, remove pain in the head and the eyes, balance the humors in the womb after childbirth, and kill worms that lived in the stomachs of children. It was advised that the pills should be taken with a meal and were supposed to be safe for children, adults, and the elderly. Although I was unable to find the original recipe, the 19th century recipe included ingredients like Barbados aloe, a purgative called jalap, treacle to sweeten it, and soap. As it does, science and medicine continued to evolve during the 17th century and 18th century. Prior to the 18th century, there were less than a dozen medical schools spread throughout Western Europe. However, the medical advancements during the Renaissance created a new interest in the field. This interest led to an increase of medical learning at universities, hospitals, and specialty schools for those who wished to learn a particular medical trade, such as anatomy or surgery. This resulted in great strides being made in medical specialties, including dentistry, obstetrics and gynecology, ophthalmology, embryology, and a deeper understanding of the circulatory and digestive systems. The medical community also developed the resuscitative process, now called CPR. The process was developed in Scotland by William Taussig. The first national society promoting its use was started in Amsterdam, and by the end of the century, there was a society promoting its use in most major cities in Europe and America, including London, Paris, Berlin, Philadelphia, and Boston. Despite medical advancements of the Enlightenment, quack doctors persisted. The increased circulation of newspapers throughout England gave these doctors a new way of advertising their wares. Rather than the poorest of people hawking fake cures, the modern 18th century charlatan was well-dressed and looked respectable. But looks can be deceiving, and it was during this era that people learned that patented medicine didn't necessarily mean real or safe medicine. The first patented compound medicine was approved by Parliament in England in 1711. Stoughton's restorative cordial and medicine was patented the following year. Stoughton was an actual apothecary who sold out of his shop the sign of the unicorn in Southwark, England. It's a part of London. The restorative was supposed to be used for stomach issues. Although he never released the recipe, he did say there were 22 ingredients and that 50 or 60 drops should be taken in water. In 1728, a warning was published regarding Dr. Stoughton's Elixir Magnum Stomachum, which stated that the patent had expired in 1726, and there were several counterfeit sorts that had been made since. In 1720, Dr. Bateman's pectoral pills were approved for patent. Like most quack medicine, it was supposed to treat all manner of ills, many of which we now know to be completely unrelated. The pectoral pills were supposed to strengthen the body by curing fevers, chronic pain, rheumatism, influenza, and violent colds. The main ingredients were camphor, aniseed, and opium. There was no specified dosage.
Hey, Nikki, did you want to take a question or two?
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. So I know there's a million of these patent medicines, but we got a question about one specific one. I don't know
Okay.
the answer to this one. What was in Carter's little liver pills? Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't know off the top of my head, but I can probably find out. Is
I
there a
could,
way to get back to?
I could find out.
Okay.
Because yeah, I mean there were a million of these things.
There were 200 patented by the end of the 18th century. But ones that weren't patented, literally millions. Like I said, I can probably find out.
Okay. What kind of qualifications did someone have to have at this time to be an apothecary?
So apothecaries actually went through usually rigorous training. You had to be in London, at least. You had to be a member of the Apothecaries Guild. You had to have an apprenticeship of at least 7 years, and then even after the apprenticeship, there was some licensure within the guild.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier about the taboos with human dissection.
Yeah.
So can you explain a little bit more about why there was such a taboo behind dissecting human bodies as opposed to just going off of looking like an animal and figuring it was all the same?
Right. So that actually stems out of a lot of religious beliefs. So the people, Christians, Catholics, wanted to keep the body whole, because the idea, even though it sort of changed depending on what century you were talking about, but overall, the idea was when the reckoning happened, the body itself was going to rise out of the grave, and for Judgment Day. So if you didn't have the body itself in the grave, or the pieces were strewn all over, there was a fear that the pieces would not be able to re-find each other to be rejoined, or that they would not actually be able to rise up anyway. And that was a lot of Descartes' work on the soul, and why it was important to keep the soul condensed within medicine. Because if the soul couldn't wake up and the body couldn't rise, there were going to be some problems.
All right.
Theologically.
Thanks, Nicole.
Yep. All righty, let's talk about Dr. Daffy. So Dr. Daffy was a supposed doctor who had made his own elixir. In this case, his elixir was called a health-bringing drink, and it was supposed to cure just about anything: coughs, colds, rheumatism, gout, kidney and bladder stones, colic, scurvy, the plague, and fevers. It was initially created around 1650 and was a household name by 1707. The ingredients included the laxative senna, anise, caraway, coriander, licorice root, raisins, and about 3 quarts of French brandy. It was included in the London Pharmacopoeia in 1720, and it was used throughout the 19th century. Despite its popularity, people were pretty wise to Dr. Daffy by 1747. Ads were taken out in local newspapers warning people that the elixir was a notorious counterfeit that cheated the public and ruined the health of people who bought it. Another popular elixir of the same time was Dawson's elixir, and this potion was supposed to cure colic, gastrointestinal issues, kidney stones, and bladder ulcers. Additionally, it was supposed to ease child delivery, relieve women of the pain following childbirth, big pain. It also reportedly cured headaches, toothaches, earaches, joint pain, rheumatism, coughs, colds, and fevers. Although the ingredients were not directly identified, it was identified as a liquor that was strong enough to destroy kidney and bladder stones. By 1748, there were over 200 well-known quack medicines in England. The sale of these remedies were done with as much pizzazz as possible. Street performers called out their wares on boxes and benches, and the medicines were often sold in stores and apothecary, chemist stores, pharmacies. However, one needed to be careful about where they bought them. Sometimes stores would buy from the wrong vendor, so they'd be selling medicine by the same name that could have wildly different results or not work at all. Those who could afford to move from town to town had the advantage. The problem with selling phony medicine was emphasized in Disney's 1977 version of Pete's Dragon. in it, Terminus came in with a literal song and dance all about the amazing things that his tonic could cure. But because he'd been there before, people had trouble believing that his medicine had actual therapeutic benefits. The 19th century ushered in a whole new world of medicine. This is just a small sampling of the many inventions and changes in medical theories that occurred during this time. The use of Edward Jenner's smallpox vaccine, which had been developed in the late 1700s, was exported for use in the United States in 1800 and began to be used throughout Western Europe by 1813. The first human blood transfusions were done in 1818. Nitrous oxide started to be used as an anesthetic in 1844, and leukemia was identified as a blood disorder the following year. And of course, Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch identified the germ theory in the 1860s. As medicine advanced, quack medicine advanced. People still came to town on horse-drawn carriages. Their false cures continued to be sold in stores and shops. They continued to be advertised in newspaper with little oversight. And those seeking a patent still did not need to give their ingredients out in order to get it patented, which then made it easy for other people to counterfeit their patents. One of the most rich and successful quack doctors was named James Morrison. His universal pills were supposed to cure all manner of incurable woes. Being sickly himself, when the medical community couldn't help him, he turned to making his own medicine. He believed doctors to be useless. He believed that all diseases were caused by something being wrong with the blood. For this, he decided that purging would fix the issue. Therefore, his universal pills were basically vegetable laxatives. He believed that his pills could cure all illnesses, and if it didn't work, the person just needed to take more. The ingredients in his pills were generally harmful to the body. He included purgatives and herbal ingredients that were strong enough to cause stomach and kidney damage. Worse yet, these purgative pills turned deadly when people started taking them by the thousands. In response, different satirical pictures, such as this one, started to be published in newspapers and magazines. The one on this slide accompanied a statement saying, "The wonderful effect of Morrison's vegetable pills. They told me if I took 1,000 pills at night, I should be quite another thing in the morning." By the 1830s, the damage that quackery had done and could continue to cause was being discussed legally. Although quack medicine hurt the reputation of reputable physicians and medical practitioners, they were generally indifferent to the trade. In part, this was because those reputable physicians were connected to the trade. This was the case in MacLeod's bread pills, which were made of nothing but bread, and they were sold in St. George's Hospital. And even if doctors did not make money directly from their sale, they were still known for endorsing them, and they were not sanctioned for doing so. So, the problem had been identified. It had been identified that people took advantage of desperate, scared people during the 16th and 17th centuries, especially during times of plague. It was easier back then. Modern medicine was in its infancy, and much of the trusted theory was still dependent on the humoral theory. Purgatives and other medicines that made a person feel worse before they felt better were common. But that didn't mean that nobody cared about the validity of the medicine that was being received. During the 16th century, the Royal College of Physicians created a council of censors who were responsible for overseeing medical practices throughout London. They were granted the authority to search, fine, press charges, and punish those who illegally practiced medicine. They would often arrive without calling ahead, so to speak, and would demand to see paperwork, receipts, storerooms, and private areas to ensure that the medicine being sold in London was of top quality. Quack doctors or people selling fake cures and elixirs were fined, and some were even jailed for their foray into illegal medicine. During the 18th and 19th centuries, there were debates on if quack medicine should be regulated. Some thought that regulating it gave it credence. Others thought that not regulating it put society at risk. In 1783, the medical stamp duty was created to tax quack medicines. The act forced those selling medicines in Great Britain to have a license to do so. Any medicine that was sold had a tax on the container. Medicines that were sold by reputable medical practitioners, apothecaries, chemists, druggists, or those who had served in an apprenticeship to a military surgeon were exempt from having to pay the tax. This attempt at legislation failed immediately. It was replaced the following year by the Medical Stamp Act of 1785. This act taxed each bottle of medicine and made the seller responsible for paying it. This act taxed every bottle, pill, packet of medicine that was sold in Great Britain. And it was much more successful. It brought in over 12,000 pounds a year until 1800, when the taxes collected jumped to 14,000 pounds. During the 19th century, the English sociologist Herbert Spencer thought that quack medicine provided a practical application for natural selection. He believed that legislative protection against quackery impeded the natural selection of society. Similarly, in 1875, the duty on quack medicines was decreased, making them easier to buy and to sell. When this happened, large department stores like Harrods bought up the quack medicine at discounted prices and sold them cheaply to their customers. During the 1880s, medical societies tried to legislate the labeling of quack medicine, particularly to those that included poisons such as chloroform or strychnine. However, it was not until 1890 that all medication that did not release their ingredients had to be marked as poison. If quack medicines were improperly labeled, the person selling the medicine would be fined. Less privately owned companies would sell them, and after 1894, only licensed doctors and pharmacists could sell properly labeled quack medicines. This gave the reputable medical practitioners control over what medicines were being sold and eased quack medicine out of the hands of the general public and those who sought to profit from their ignorance or misfortune. So I want to thank you all for attending my talk, and thank you, Jim, and to the museum for hosting me. Does anybody have any questions?
I think we do have a few in the queue here.
Sure.
Let me go ahead and start working on those. You talked earlier about military medicine. So what kind of qualifications you have to become a surgeon's apprentice in like the Royal Navy, for example?
As far as I've seen, you had to have an interest. If you were part of the Royal Navy and you had an interest, they set you up. It wasn't like now where you have to have, credentials.
Okay. So let's see, we've got a stack here. So what kinds of ingredients would you find in these patent medicines?
Mostly purgatives, something that made you expel. A lot of opium, some quinine that they call Peruvian bark. And then, like I was saying, in the late 19th century, it became more poisonous, and you started seeing more things like chloroform or things like strychnine, things that would actually actively kill you.
All right. So how did European knowledge and practices compare with like Chinese medicine at the time?
I can't answer that. I'm sorry, I don't know enough about Chinese medicine or something outside of Western Europe to answer that.
I can't contribute on that one either. Let's see. Is there any estimate of the number of people who died at the hands of quack doctors?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I don't know the answer to it. So here's the problem. So when people were being seen in their homes, And if these people were coming through the town and just selling you a bottle or a pill of whatever, there weren't case studies. So, and even if there were case studies, there weren't follow-up appointments. So you might have, a case study of, person went to doctor because they were, violently ill, and we know that they took this pill or this bolus. They might be able to see if they had a good enough doctor at the time who wanted to know what was in it, they might be able to go back to the apothecary and ask. But if the person was never seen by a doctor, or the doctor never thought about it, all it was this person was sick and we gave them something else and sent them home. And then there wasn't a follow-up appointment. So that sort of question, I would love that answer. I would love that answer for a lot of different things. But unfortunately, the notes and the documentation that was kept during the time isn't really conducive to us guessing. I mean, if I had to guess, I would say in the tens or hundreds of thousands, but it would only be a guess.
Okay. And I mean, isn't it pretty much true that a lot of times the patient would get better in spite of the medicine rather than because of it?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, got a couple more here. So how did Quack Medicine kind of make its way across the Atlantic to the U.S.?
Well, since this is the 18th century, so for the vast majority of the 18th century, the U.S. was still, a British colony, so people brought it with them. They brought the same fears, the same, misunderstandings about medicine, about how medicine worked and how the body worked. So, if there were people who wanted to make money off of people's fears, that's going to crop up anywhere.
Okay. So there are actually any positives from Quack Medicine? Did we learn kind of what not to do?
I think that, I think so. I think that a lot of, the dangers of opium, which of course were used in medicine, I mean, right into the 19th, if not early 20th century. But, you saw how addictive it was. And, there were a lot of things about legalities. I mean, I explained a 300-year period, and it wasn't until the end of that period that people really thought, maybe we should regulate this somehow. So you saw how necessary it became and how to phase something out, which is basically what they did by the end of the 19th century. So I think that a lot of things were learned about maybe sociology, maybe a little psychology, and certainly the way different compounds work together. Okay, so
do you have a personal all-time favorite Quack Medicine or Quack medical practice?
I do love Dr. James Morrison's vegetable pills. It's not due to the pills themselves, but because, when he didn't like what the doctor said, he just went off on his own and made up his own medicine, and not just the medicine and, take it by the thousands. Just keep taking it until it works, or it doesn't. But if it doesn't, you tended to die. So, it was just so extreme, and it was so extreme that it's the only time I've ever seen an actual campaign launched against a quack medicine. I mean, others would have people saying, don't take this, it's bad for you, it's counterfeit, it's not the real thing, whatever. But Dr. Morrison, or James Morrison, I shouldn't call him doctor, should actually had an entire campaign of caricatures and satire, and look them up, they're hysterical, just launched against him so that people would stop taking his pills. And I think his entire story is just fascinating.
So when people took these patent medicines, they would expect to get sick from it often enough. Is that right?
Kind of. They expected to get, usually they expected to get better, but, if you took opium, you felt better. I mean, that's just the nature of opium. But if you took strychnine, you felt worse. And purgatives were so common in normal medicine that the idea that you felt worse and you got sicker before you felt better was just normal.
That kind of brings us back to a question we had earlier about the Carter's little liver pills. They contain, the active ingredient was a very powerful laxative. So
There you go.
There makes perfect sense.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. I think we've maybe got time for one more. Let me see what else we've got here. Can you talk a little bit about the medical use of electricity early
Oh, wow. Sure, I can. So that started to be used in the late 18th century, and the idea was to stimulate the nerves in your skin initially, and it was, from what I remember, it was kind of like a crank battery, the one from the 18th century. So that I wouldn't actually term that as quack medicine. That, in my view, is closer to people trying to evolve the theories of medicine. People trying to, see what worked and what didn't. It's very big in the, obviously, in the 19th century, because then we start having fiction about it, and you start seeing things like Frankenstein, and bringing people back from the dead by, electroshock. So that's, but as much as Shelley was a extremist, she was still relying on medical thought, the thought, medical theory, things that people were kind of fleshing out, pardon the pun, at the time. So I actually have a problem lumping that in with the same medicines that people were using, and they knew they weren't going to work, and they knew they were probably going to cause people to become more sick or dependent on a drug or die.
I think that's absolutely fair. Yeah. All right. So thank you very much for joining us today, Ms. Nicole Salomone. I'm very happy to get a fellow historian on here any chance that I get, especially one that's a fan of weird and morbid stuff like I am. So thank you all for being here today. What we've got lined up for you next week, we have a geologist from University of Maryland, Dr. Laurent Montesi, and he's going to talk about volcanic activity on Venus. This is brand new work that was just recently published about active volcanoes, the possibility of active volcanoes on Venus. You can register for next week's talk at smv.org. Each talk is free to attend and is open to the first 300 registrants. Thank you all again for joining us today. Until next week, stay safe and stay curious.